All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And as you're getting your drinks, you can make your way back up here, because this session it's going to be about 45 minutes long, and then we'll do lunch. But I'm going to give maybe just about a 15-minute intro here, and then I want to really promote discussion. And I know one of the comments that came in from our online attendees is going to be relevant to one of the discussion tools that we're going to talk about, which is how do we help people with spinal cord injury find clinical trials. So let's go ahead and get started. And so this session is about tools for researchers to engage people with SCI. What we, one of our first projects that you've heard it mentioned here was Heather Gainforth's project on developing guiding principles for integrated knowledge translation specific for spinal cord injury. And now this is a really thorough project that Heather is doing, and it's going to take her a little while to get through the different stages of it. And then we found ourselves being, requested, okay, how do we engage people with spinal cord injuries? So we felt like, okay, we need to start creating some tools and resources for researchers now so that they can start engaging people with spinal cord injuries. And then as Heather is rolling out more and more of her findings, we can incorporate all of that in. So I'm gonna go through some things that we're going to put, we're gonna create a resource page on our website, the NASCIC website, that is going to talk about and have links to all of these different tools. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg on the tools that are out there. So let's go forward to the next slide. And the underlying concept of engagement, and I used animation, so you have to go forward. So the underlying concept of engagement is the inclusion of all stakeholders in the research process. It will yield stronger, more relevant, and more useful results, leading to greater uptake, which that means greater impact and people start feeling it. So go forward. And as Barry mentioned, people living with a disease bring in expertise that's traditionally missing from the expertise that's in the research team. So having that collective expertise is what makes us stronger. And including people living with a disease as a research partner should be based on these underlying principles that are out there, and Heather is really developing more of these principles. But these principles are almost kind of common sense about being a human being, having a reciprocal relationship, co-learning, being a partnership, being transparent, being honest, and building trust. That's really how we can all function in all our different activities. So those are the underlying concepts. Go forward. And you've seen this before. This is actually the full postcard and diagram that they have created. And just so I know it's hard to read those words, I'm gonna tell you what the bigger definition of each one of these. So if you go forward, the research question is really what John mentioned, collaborating to develop and refine research questions that matter. And that can be on a small individual grant level, or it can be on a larger programmatic level. The next stage is with the funding application, and that's in involvement with what John Genzel mentioned, is having someone in the actual putting the grant package together, or being involved in grant review panels, like the DoD has for quite some time now, always had a consumer reviewer on their different grant panels. And the Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, is all about this, and they have consumer advisory panels significantly. The next step is actually developing the methods, and we hear a lot about it in partnering to design a human study that people want to participate in. But it's also partnering in, identifying understanding the tools that basic science researchers have. What are you trying to accomplish? Okay, for example, what is it about bladder that's the problem? Do we need to be looking at incontinence? Do we need to be looking at storage? That kind of thing can be very helpful for what a basic scientist picks as an outcome measure. The next stage is then actual conducting the research and being integrated as an equitable member of the team. And this is one area that people really, really, really want to be involved in. And then next In the analysis and publishing of the data, seeking input on interpretation of the results. We recently had a project get submitted to us, and the person submitting the project said, well, how can somebody help me interpret the results? And are they a statistician? No, that's not the point of that, is that you come up with your statistically significant results or whatever it is that is out of the data, and then scientists convey that in lay language, because that's important to everybody. And then the person with the spinal cord injury or the disease can actually think about that and put it in the context of what they're living with and give feedback. Okay, what does this really mean? And you come up with a stronger interpretation. And then lastly is with the dissemination, and this is really where networks can really be very helpful. You can collaborate with networks to ensure that results are not just reaching the peer-reviewed publications and the scientists that look at those particular publications, but also that the results are getting out into the community. And maybe that the results are getting out into specific healthcare providers' hands or into the community's hands so they can take it to their primary healthcare provider. There's a lot of different end users of knowledge, and they interpret that in different ways. And so being able to disseminate the results in language for the different stakeholder, I think, is really important area. Okay, next. So just some examples of engagement, and we've had these examples come through in our projects. Seeking an individual from the community to be a research partner. Next, these will be kind of quick. Developing a relationship with a consumer organization. Developing a consumer advisory board to help guide the research from all the way through the whole cycle, from the funding application through the dissemination. Gaining input, say you just want some input on your inclusion and exclusion criteria for something you're designing. You could actually go out and seek engagement that way. Next one, interacting with consumer advisors, like I just mentioned, to help to interpret the research data to put it into context of the real world experience. And working with community advocates for the translation of promising research. And translation, I will home in on this a lot today. It's an entire spectrum of research that we're gonna get to. Okay, and lastly, interacting with members of the community to disseminate the findings in lay language. So one thing that has come up a lot that researchers have asked for guidance on this, and it is about compensation for engagement. And first point is that the type of compensation, the amount and the details of this financial compensation, it should be relative to the circumstance, expertise, and the degree of input of the engaged partner, whoever that engaged partner is. And the rates for a community member as a partner should be consistent with rates of other members of your team as partners. Compensation, it's not a myth, it is an allowable budget item. Researchers put in compensation for consultants all the time in their grants. So they use a consultant for maybe one piece or maybe a couple pieces of their project, and you can put it in as a line item in your budget. And really importantly, remember, research partners are not research participants. There are very clear restrictions on compensation of research participants because we don't want to coerce people to being in the research study just for the money. A research partner is actually a member of the team, and that's a different setting. Next point, some guidance tips on compensation. So it could be on an hourly basis, it could be on a stipend, it could be full day, half day, it could be employing somebody as a member of your research team and they're on the salary. It's not just one thing, it's very flexible. The next point is that, this is a really important point, is that the compensation should be flexible to any financial restrictions that a person may be on. And a lot of healthcare providers know about this, and a lot of service providers may know about this, but researchers may not know about this. And the fact is that in the US and in Canada, most times if you are receiving government assistance either for disability income or for parts of insurance coverage, they, at least in the United States, they put a really strict financial restriction on the amount of disposable income you can have and that you can receive. So then, okay, how do we compensate someone for their time without putting them into a dangerous situation of losing their services? So some examples that have come up with, and we actually, Jen asked the project review committee for some examples because some of those members are actually on financial restrictions. And so some of the things that they thought up of are, gift cards, postal money orders. They may elect that, okay, whatever compensation you're going to give to me, I want you to donate it to an organization instead of direct payment. Or it could be a gift, or it could be in-kind exchange, perhaps a payment to their partner, their spouse, or somebody that is not on a financial restriction. Actually, many people may or may not know this, is that people will sometimes make a decision not to get married so that they actually don't lose their benefits. A lot of people have to do that. If you want to be married, you should be able to have that luxury just like everybody else. It shouldn't be dictated because of a benefit that you need. Okay. And also importantly, covering expenses, like if you need people to go with you to an event or come to your research center, whatever, that's separate from compensation for your time. And there are two really, really good resources here that go into much more depth. I just kind of picked out some of the highlights here. But PCORI has a wealth of resources. We're going to put all of these onto our website. There was the framework for engaging research partners, and then CIHR, which is basically the Canadian equivalent of NIH, are quite progressive in this area. And they have actually they have a lot of discussion about compensation, but they do also get into not impeding somebody's financial situation if they are restricted in receiving income. So, and I know Dennis has asked me about questions for this, so I hope that this kind of information will start to be very helpful. I'm going to go through a couple other resources that we will put on our website. Like I mentioned, PCORI, they've got a really good, what they call a rubric around engagement and all the underlying framework. This is not new. This has been going on in many different disease areas for quite a long time. They've got a good resource on the value of engagement. And in fact, for anyone that receives NIH funding in research, NIH is very, very strong on diversity and how including diverse backgrounds and diverse expertise can actually strengthen research. Well, you can think of this as the same concept. The diversity of bringing in a person with that disease that you're studying strengthens it and values it as well. CIHR has a really good guide for researcher and knowledge user collaboration, and a toolkit for patient-focused therapy development. The National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences is part of NIH, and they are really, really good wealth of resources. Our next slide. There are two good webinars that have been archived. One is by PCORI on engagement, and one is actually that Heather Gainforth did for the Michael Smith Foundation on health research. These are really informative, and people learn in different ways. It's not always just about reading, so sometimes hearing things is really helpful. The next one is there are different tips for engagement. The Michael Smith Foundation has a lot of tips. The Science of Patient Input and Milken Institute for Faster Cures is a really, really good resource. And actually, Jen was invited, it was an invitation-only workshop in mid-September on this exact topic of building capacity for different disease populations to be engaged in the research process. And we're gonna work with them. They're all about sharing tools and not reinventing the wheel. What are some resources that can cross-cover diseases? And then what are resources that you might need to tailor for your disease-specific area? And the FDA Center for Devices has a very strong center in patient engagement. And like we mentioned, NASCIC has been invited to be a pilot member, one of 14 members in this patient and caregiver program that they have recently just launched. And not only will they be able to receive input from the different diseases that are represented from the 14 organizations, we will be able to give them feedback on this program to help them strengthen the program. And they're cognizant it shouldn't just be a one-way street. We should be able to go give information back and forth so that when they are ready to broaden the program, hopefully it will be a stronger program at that point. And then, okay, so I just want to end near here, and we can open it up for discussions. But NASCIC does have a lot of resources, and we've mentioned this with the facilitating project partnerships. We've got 8 project partnerships already, and they really do get really active engagement and input from the members of the project review committee. And on our website, we continue to refine our guidelines to be more and more helpful for people that are submitting project requests. And next, we just recently opened up a project engagement database for those people that really do want to take the next step and be actively involved. Like I said, everybody's got different things that they do in their life, and sometimes some people just want to be receiving information. But for those people that do want to be actively involved, we've got 46 people already, and we just opened this up a couple months ago, and we've been increasing in number surprisingly quickly. And so when we get a project approved through all the steps in NASCIC, then the first place we turn to is to the project engagement database to see who wants to be involved. And then we will turn out to all of our members and all of our different organizations. And within the database, we can then, we're collecting information, some general information about diversity related to gender, related to injury level, whether they are actually a person with spinal cord injury or a family member, so that when somebody says, because one of the recommendations is that if you're going to have a 4 or 5 member team of research partners, then they should be diversely representing whatever the question is. So we can start to pull and help create those diverse panels for people to make it a little bit easier. So the last thing that I want to end up on, and this is going to get into a discussion on clinical trials and human research, but from our needs assessment survey, this is something that's really important to people with spinal cord injury. They want to know how to find trials. And we had a comment that came in from one of our people online who is a clinical trialist wanting to know how to find people for trials. So one of the biggest problems in clinical trials is recruitment. And when you're in a clinical trial stage of research, you're really looking at efficacy. And efficacy is what's the outcome in a narrow population. Because by definition, as you go through from very risky or unknown phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, a lot more, your inclusion and exclusion criteria have to be narrow for certain regions, especially if you're really looking at safety. And so all of the clinical trial work, 1, 2, and 3, is really about efficacy. So in this limited population around our inclusion and exclusion criteria, what are we seeing? So that actually makes it really hard for a lot of people to participate. And it's hard to find everybody that meets that. So we've been involved in a project that is also supported by End Paralysis Foundation and Fuel Source to create this platform for people with spinal cord injuries, and we just launched it on Tuesday. And it's called scitrials.org. And you can see all of our different supporting community organizations over here. And the point is to connect the two communities, connect scientists doing human research and the community living with spinal cord injury. And one, we want to make it so that people with spinal cord injuries can find the spinal cord injury trials faster and easier. Going on to clinicaltrials.gov is all different diseases, so it's really hard to filter things down. Putting up a lay language overview of the trial. You can actually personalize based on different outcomes that you think are important or different strategies that you're interested. You can receive updates on those trials, so you can personalize it to your needs. And then lastly, you can click on a button to apply for the trial. Now this is where I want to open up the question to the room is, okay, that's all one-sided and from enabling the community. What can we do, what do clinical researchers and clinical trialists and CROs that are looking for people, what do they need? What's a better way to connect with people? And we're almost done here. And I just want to end with some comments that came in through our needs assessment survey on research. So if you go forward. First one, would like more information on how to participate in clinical trials, have volunteered and never get a response. Next, seems almost impossible to be included in stimulator research. Just like everything else in the world, it's all in who you know. Regular folks apply and will never get a call. Next, I think being able to navigate through all the research and trials easier for patients is crucial. Making the process easier would be so much helpful. Also, getting responses back. I submit an email for consideration and most times do not hear anything back. Other times it may be months. The waiting is so hard. Next, calling on clinical trials people don't get back to you. It seems the follow-up from emails don't get answered. Breakdown of communication, and when you have an SCA, it's even harder to follow up. So it seems like email is not the answer. And so I would like to open up to the audience, what are ways that would be more effective at connecting people? We're finding ways to inform people. How do we connect people? And we have our first question back here at the back of the room.
Okay. I think what might be helpful is on that site to allow the participants to enter their zip code. So that
we do have that ability.
You have that ability.
Mm-hmm.
So then, and have the CROs be able to access that at the point where they're choosing sites.
We don't have that ability yet.
Okay, so in order to fill these trials, particularly trials that require many visits and have a much longer time commitment, really where people live is important. And so for the CROs to be able to choose their sites based on the possible participation in the area, I think is pretty important. And there's just a few other things that I'd like to see included. And I haven't had time to access the new site, but when I look at these trials, I'm always forefront in my mind is, okay, what's the time commitment? How many visits are there? What's going to happen post-trial if it's a drug? Am I going to have access to it? And you can usually dig down into trials to find that, but I would like it to be upfront. So, I just think that a lay person's synopsis of the time requirement and what's going to happen post-study will increase engagement from the SCI community.
Those are good points that we're taking down. We do have a lay overview of key things that we've gotten feedback from a handful of people with spinal cord injury, key things that they wanted to know, but we do have the feature enabled for people to give feedback. So if we come up with other issues like this, well, I have access to the intervention after the study, we can try to figure that out. And sometimes, well, I would say oftentimes the answer is going to be no, until, unless it's a unique design in the study. But that's important for people to know and important to put on there. Kimberly.
Hi, I'm Kim Flieger from AbbVie Pharmaceuticals in Chicago, and I just want to thank everybody for allowing me to be here today. On this topic specifically, our trial is going to be a phase 2 in the acute setting. So we're not recruiting patients, we're recruiting sites. Even just this meeting, I've got some information on how to find additional sites, but how can we do that in the acute setting? Maybe not through the trial finder, but through this community and connecting us through acute care settings.
Yeah, one thing that I have mentioned in different settings is that, well, so most SCI rehabilitation centers will have some kind of a peer support network in their inpatient facility. And oftentimes there is a link between the level 1 trauma center and the SCI rehabilitation center, at least in communication, there's a link. So I've always thought that if we, if companies would reach out to the peer support networks associated with the hospital before they start the trial, this could be part of your site search, and connect with those sites that have good peer support networks, because they may be able to help engage and encourage the physicians to buy into it more as they have relationships with them. And then maybe choose sites that really have those strong relationships, because that can also help you with retention afterwards, so you don't lose people afterwards. And am I seeing Bill, you're raising your hand, because United Spine, oh, John and then Bill, okay.
It's interesting, John Sikora with Synapse, and Kim, I think that's a really interesting point, because one of the troubles that we have is finding the right clinician. So for us, it's an active surgeon, somebody in PM&R who wants to follow a patient. So that's more of a trouble for us when we're talking about a trial. It's wonderful that there are patients that want our device or to have some sort of stimulation. It's secondarily finding, and the biggest issue is finding that clinician that's going to actually implant that and wants to take on a spinal cord injury patient, because there are so few resources, especially for our tetra patients, to be sent off to a rehab center and have access to other services.
Yeah.
So it kind of cuts both ways, unfortunately.
And that's even more because you have a device that is approved and on the market. So, potentially you're opened up to other locations around the country, and they have even less knowledge. Healthcare providers have even less knowledge or interest in spinal cord injury. The bottom line is the truth that we feel every day. And so that's important for us to try to help with.
A quick comment, Kim, that might help. Whether you're recruiting individual participants or sites, and Kim mentioned support groups, you guys need to know that United Spinal has 54 chapters, 192 support groups, and 105 hospital or therapy programs that are partners with ours. And we actually just instituted an e-newsletter to our rehab partners. So that infrastructure is either already in place or has just been put in place to build, so we can do that for you. So hook up with me later.
Yeah, that's a really great resource. And the other thing, like related to acute trials, this was brought up a little bit in discussion at the SCI 2020 meeting, was about, the whole idea of, informing the community, the general community, about research interventions to try to gain some sort of, it's not community consent, but is community agreement to be able to institute or enroll somebody in a trial for that intervention before they can actually sign the consent. That's another thing that may be important to look at in the early intervention trials.
Just one quick comment on that as well, as it's really hard for us at the current stage when we can't talk about our trial until it's posted on ct.gov. So coming here and talking and learning is where we are, but when we can actually do that, that's, I think, where it's critical. But before we can be posted on ct.gov, we need sites. So it's really hard. So you have to reach out one-on-one, get CDAs, then be able to talk to people. So when you're somewhere new in this field like AbbVie is, it's really through the people that you know and the communities such as this that really helps us.
Tara, do you have a question back there?
One question is around the trials. what happens is most of these companies go to very big sites, and I will advise them that if you go to some smaller sites who are not, because if you're going to the main sites, they're already competing for these things and bringing peer support. Some of the peer support organizations cannot do this. They cannot promote which trial to do and which not. Like I belong to, I am at a funding organization. A lot of people come and say, can you promote our studies on your websites? We don't even promote our own studies. We support our studies, we fund our studies, but we do not go into recruitment. That's totally a different out of us, that how many we can, and we don't have capacity. Another thing I wanted to know, how much we are developing so much work for NASCI, how much capacity we will have to support some of this works. And just as I'm commenting, and we went through so many resources for developing what's engagement is, can we develop a 1-pager or 2-pager if NASCI has the capacity, which we can share with our stakeholders and all? That will be helpful, because these sites, not everybody can go and look at them, and maybe this is one of the next steps, or maybe we discuss this in the end, because we are going to discuss what next steps are going to be and NASCI is going to be. But if we develop a patient engagement strategy, 1 or 2 pagers,
Yeah.
how we see it, learning from all these sites, that will be, I think, helpful, and something which we can move forward and not just sit on it.
I agree. And all of these resources are going to go on our website. And that's part of the plan that Barry was talking about in building capacity, is to finding and connecting all of those different resources for everybody. But I also agree creating a short 1 or 2 pager is important as well. Do we have? I want to kind of get back to this problem though. We're promoting, we want more and more chronic research, and we just had a discussion about acute, but let's talk about chronic, and let's talk about how do we get people connected, and why is it that emails go unanswered? Dennis, we have a comment up here.
So I find it rather extraordinary that there's this overwhelming lack of communication this way. And I'm sitting here trying to understand what would account for this on the research side. And I can come up with a lot of guesses as to why people wouldn't be responding to emails, but I don't know. So one of the things I'm short of not knowing how to run a clinical trial, and I'm thinking about how do folks find these trials and these contacts to then send the contact to the researcher? But was this an email that was on a clinicaltrials.gov website, or?
Well, number one, so this just barely started, but on clinicaltrials.gov, down at the very bottom, every single one of them has a contact email.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I also wonder with clinicaltrials.gov, so we all have to put our study up on clinicaltrials.gov, and then there's a lot of things that can happen. It could be that you have to have that website up before you even have other things, even other ducks in a row. That's not an excuse for not responding to an email. If you put that email on there, you should be responsive to it. I don't know if some people have multiple emails and they put the wrong one up, or if they prefer a phone call. I don't know. I can't account for that. But with some of the things that could be happening with clinicaltrials.gov, is there a little box that says not recruiting?
Yes, you can change the status of your trial.
I actually have a trial that's on there that I have to say not recruiting.
Yeah.
And I've still gotten emails, so try to respond to them saying we're recruiting only internally for this for various reasons. But you still respond with an email. So I'd love to know if there is some idea of why the researchers are not responsive. Is it is this was it 1 email sent to the researcher and no response, or was it 3 emails and no response, which is exceedingly alarming at that point?
There are certainly situations where there are multiple emails.
Right.
I'd like to go to Megan and then Miranda and then Matthew.
So I know from talking to our therapists that when we get requests for example, for the upper extremity studies, it's felt that we want that first interaction to be a meaningful one. And a lot of times that means spending about an hour on the phone with the person to hear their story, to hear their interest in the trial, to try to suss out whether they might be eligible for it through the inclusion criteria. But it's not a cursory, quick email response. It is a 1 hour discussion and meant to be meaningful so that people don't feel like they've just been not heard. And so my understanding is that's felt to be pretty burdensome and hard to work. As folks might know, we have, I think, 200 to 300 people on the wait list for our study that's going to be enrolling 30 people. And so it's going to necessarily be disappointing to a lot of people, but that's a lot of interaction to get to those who are going to be qualified for it.
Miranda.
Yeah, so this is from a consumer standpoint, and just like in general, I think with email, a lot of people aren't great at responding. And I think on some of those trials, it's their main email box. So if they have all their other business email in there as well, and then have those come in, they perhaps don't see, or it could be that, like the East End trial, for instance, 1,000 people, there's no way they're responding to 1,000 people. I'm thinking as a solution, and it might be people that are filtered out because they don't even meet the criteria in general. I just know, like, from the social media world, I see this complaint a lot, especially with epidural stimulation. I'm thinking a solution could be either auto responses or either some type of database they apply in, like a grant where you get a status update, or like not eligible, or like there's some type of feedback or response communication through the process, because
Throughout the process.
Yes, throughout the process. And then to know, they might not actually talk to a person physically, but use technology for what it's worth and actually give feedback through the process. But I'm thinking each of those individual researchers probably don't have that capability, or if they're doing a small study, they might not have the infrastructure to be able to respond that way.
That's Matthew.
This to me seems really complicated, and I'll speak to it from the perspective of, I get emails from people about trials, or I didn't hear back from a trial, or I did hear back from a trial. And to be honest with you, anecdotally, a lot of folks reach out to a trial that shouldn't have reached out to the trial.
But maybe they didn't know that.
No, yeah, you're right. But the sort of the nut to crack is like, well, where and how was that not communicated? You know, like epidural stimulation trials. You know, people write to me and they have C4 level injury, and I'm like, well, it says, you know, you're not in the inclusion criteria. Well, but I was thinking if I could talk to, you know, no. I've had plenty of those sorts of interactions, and there's a part of me, and then like you were just, should I just say, or you want to make the comment? You know, who the clinical trial coordinator, maybe they're not the right person,
right,
to be the email, and maybe that person has changed over the course of a year or 2 years, or so there's a system problem. There's also our community problem of people maybe not fully understanding, and even like we were talking about last night, not fully understanding, is this a clinical trial or is this clinical research? And not really fully appreciating what they're emailing for. Not even to mention that you're also, for many in the community, this is their cure step. And so the way it's being understood from the community as opposed to the research community is very different. And so there's really a complex problem. And I don't necessarily think, like we were talking about last night, I don't think we failed the community. I think it's far more nuanced and far more complex than that. So the questions are the right questions, but to me, it strikes me like I gave you some anecdotal examples. Are these anecdotal examples? Or if we were to do really good system analysis, how many people are falling off? How many people are getting a response? It'd be really nice to know that, but it's hard to assess this without a real good, solid analysis.
This may be anecdote. Well, so one, how would we find that analysis? Who's going to own up to, okay, I didn't answer all those emails, right? But it is a very complicated situation because then, I mean, on the flip side, there are a lot of clinical research studies, not necessarily clinical trials. Now, they say, you know, I've had experience with this in the past, that they're going to enroll 50 people, you know, and they design this really amazing trial so they can maximize the budget. And then they don't get all those people. And it's not necessarily that everybody's being excluded. Maybe they're not doing all the effort to really reach out to the people. And so it's not a one-sided thing. It's a multifaceted thing.
So all really great comments, I have to say. Couple ones, Matthew, thinking about what you just talked about is people trying to apply for trials that they're actually not eligible for. Perhaps we could reach out to Niall, the creator of the scitrials.org website, and you know there is a button you can click on each trial to apply. Perhaps what we could do to help us facilitate the appropriate application is put a filtering system. So using the inclusion-exclusion criteria, if you click that you want to participate on the trial, then the next step is that you need to indicate some details about your particular injury, what level it is, what your incompleteness is, the time since injury, all those sorts of things that can then say, okay, if you pass this sort of preliminary criteria, then you can move forward and apply. And that way researchers aren't going to be inundated with emails that are, you know, that aren't really going to be able to apply to their trial anyway. So that could be a way we could help facilitate it.
Yeah, and we can probably use technology to do that for some of the things until you really get to the incomplete or, you know, the technical description of AIS, A, B, C, or D, because people hear a lot of different things and out in the field, those aren't always done the correct way. So people get bad information to begin with. So we wouldn't to exclude people because they have the wrong information.
True. And then another point I wanted to make is around integrated knowledge translation, about the idea of having persons with lived experience as equal partners on your research team, just like you would bring in any other expert. One thing, my partner Terry does a lot of work in recruitment, and one thing she's told me many, many times, the trials that are easiest to recruit for are the ones that people want to be a part of. And you know which ones they want to be a part of? Ones that people have helped shape the question of. So if you're asking a question that's interesting people with spinal cord injury, and you're making sure that, you know, as you said, there's some trials that have a lot of trouble recruiting. One of the challenges they often do is they create inclusion-exclusion criteria that eliminates a huge portion of the population. You know, I know of one particular study, I don't want to name names here, but it was an imaging study. And one of the exclusion criteria was if you had any metallic hardware in your spine. Well, you know, what percentage of people with spinal cord injury don't have metallic hardware in their spine? And having a person with a spinal cord injury help you in that designing that protocol would make it clear to you, hey, that's not going to work, you know? And so you've got this great researcher who's got all this money to do this amazing trial and nobody's eligible for it. This is the concept of integrated knowledge translation, is getting that lived experience into the team to help address these issues in trial questioning and design. That's going to save everybody a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money.
We have one last comment here and then we'll open for lunch.
See how I live at home? I'm just telling you because I'm the youngest.
Jen and then Dale.
Just so you guys know. So I wanted to drive home John's point with a real world example that was given to us when we were at the Milken Institute. It was a gentleman from a fairly large pharmaceutical company that made this comment, that they started a clinical trial with no patient involvement whatsoever. When they were more than halfway through the time frame, they only had a third of the people recruited. They actually shut down that trial Then what they did is they reevaluated, brought in the patient community to help reform that trial, and they made their trial recruitment in half the time that they were expecting with that new trial. So that's a live example of what it means to have a patient involvement in a clinical trial.
And Dale, did you have one last comment before lunch? Dale, right here.
So like the rest of the world, when I'm faced with a problem, I go to YouTube.
Yeah.
I can't change the light bulb in my Lexus, right?
Yeah.
So I go to YouTube and somebody's posted a thing. So while we've been sitting here, I went to YouTube and said, spinal cord injury research trials. There isn't anything that explains all that. There's a bunch of stuff that if I were a patient, I'm like, oh, stem cell trials, use embryonic stem cell. There are all these little vignettes that kind of lead me into a cloudy area that I'm not quite sure what in the heck I should be looking at.
Okay.
Just as a thought.
That's a really good
As
resource.
as an organization, one of the things that we could do is produce very brief YouTube videos. You're interested in clinical trial. Here are the things you need to know. Here's a glossary. Here's what you need to understand. Here's how you get in contact with us if you have more questions.
Excellent.
I think those are the kind of resources that make it very simple and help people find out, oh, okay, now I know where to begin.
And did we have a question online, Devin? Yeah. Let's go online first.
Yeah, so we just have a few comments from people, so I'm just going to put them up on the main board here. Hopefully we can, I don't even know if we can see that there on the back.
Oh.
Can you blow that up? No.
Multi-center trials are seemingly tough in that coordinators vary in enthusiasm, and therefore a centralized person and perhaps someone really engaging and investment in advancement of SCI trials seems logical. Also, finding local networks around trial locations for places to stay would help enable participation. The research community would love to make the connection. We are bound by our IRBs and not allowed to call someone without prior consent, even to just invite them to participate. It would be great to have that connection for shared opportunities. You can actually make requests for waivers for recruitment through your IRBs, so you can get around that. Krista was the first one. Heather Taylor was the second one. And this one I'm going to read now is from Krista. Not responsive to email equals contact person might simply be overwhelmed and not have time. All the more, why mentor networks like Kim mentioned is great. 5-minute Skypes work well too to circumvent long emails. I'm working with a trial. The IRB allows me to go out and talk to potential candidates, like go to Abilities Expo, eyeball candidates and talk to them. We have discussions, quick initial, they've discussed the quicker initial video screen prior to any signatures, video screening prior to any consenting. Okay, that is really going to be the last question, Shelley.
I just want to comment on the responding to or accessing clinical trials. I agree with all these comments. Many times the study coordinators are super busy or very busy, or they're not engaged and they aren't responding. Just to give you a real life experience that I've had in the past working with a sponsor, a pharma company, that they had all kinds of hits on their website for people wanting to participate. Again, as Matthew said, people will call regardless of what the inclusion-exclusion criteria is, just because they want to participate. But we did a clinical trial. It was a subacute trial, and the link on clinicaltrials.gov was directly to one person. The sponsor company agreed to fund someone to particularly answer all the questions. There was a script that they asked these people. They ultimately got them on the phone. It wasn't
first they emailed, then they had to give their phone number so that they were called. The script had to be approved by everyone's IRB up front, but it was a very generic script just to determine if they met the criteria for the study so that they could weed them out that way. Every single one of those people were responded to, whether they met the criteria or not, and it was very successful to have that one central location. So just, you know, as a sponsor, something to keep in mind. You want to go that extra mile because the study coordinators are overworked. They don't always respond.
Yeah, and they usually don't have enough funds to really support the study coordinator in the way that they really need to do 60 hours of work instead of 40 hours. Okay, so we're gonna break for lunch, and actually it's getting a little bit warm in here for me. I'm sure you guys are really having some heat waves. We're gonna come back at 12:30 and we will have our partner panel discussion. All right.